Well, let's continue our journey through the Level 1 economics curriculum with a reading here on international trade and capital flows, our introduction at Level 1 to international economics. We've got 9 LOSs in this reading, so it's a fairly short section. Here we'll talk about some definitions, talk about some arguments for free trade, talk about restrictions on trade, balance of payments accounts, and then lastly we'll look at some economic unions, monetary unions, currency unions, things like that, and get all straight on the differences among them. So let's jump right in and talk about two terms that we'll use quite a bit, GDP and GNP. Now, gross domestic product, that's the value of goods and services produced in a country, and I think we saw that before in a different part of the curriculum. So this is within a country, this is the assets and the people within the country. Now, GNP, on the other hand, gross national product, value of goods and services produced by a country's citizens and assets owned by those citizens. So foreign assets owned abroad by a country's citizens now count in GNP. Income of citizens working abroad, that also counts in a country's GNP, and then it goes the other way too. Income made in the domestic country by capital owned by foreigners, that's going to be in the foreign country's GNP, but not in the domestic country's GNP. And same thing with workers. So where they're located for GDP and what country they're a citizen of for GNP. And you should remember here that between the two, GDP is going to be the better measure for measuring economic activity of a country. Okay? GNP, a little bit different, not as good on telling what's going on within the country because it excludes the foreign workers and foreign capital in that calculation. Now, overall, look at the bottom of this slide first. Economists, benefit outweigh the costs. Economists are for free trade, and the argument for opening up trade and free trade is very old in economics. Now we'll talk about some special cases, but overall the benefits are lower cost to consumers of imports and also higher unemployment, wages, and profits in export industries. So free trade drives these export industries. Now there are some costs of free trade, but they're not overall, they're on particular groups. So the costs are on the displacement of workers and lost profits in industries competing with imported goods. So it's not just costs placed on the workers, but also on the producers. So take an example of textile manufacturing. Okay. The U.S. has lost a lot of textile manufacturing business over the last couple of decades. And what has gone on here is that foreign competition with lower prices for a wide variety of textiles, not all of them, but for a wide variety of them, put competition against domestic textile industries. And those industries have shrunk. The jobs have been lost. People who own textile factories and assets specific to textile productions, they all lost. The point of economists is that the gains will outweigh the losses. Now, those workers that were in textiles have moved to healthcare, they've moved to IT, they've learned new skills, and moved on there. So now one could argue they're more productive and we're getting textiles at a lower cost. So overall, we're better off. But the problem with this opening up international trade is that there are specific groups that are affected, and these specific groups often lobby government for protection. And we'll see some of those types of protections coming up. But first, we want to talk a little bit more about the potential gains from trade and the economic theory behind it. So two terms you have to be real familiar with here are absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Now, when we talk about absolute advantage, we're talking about lower cost in terms of resources. So if we're comparing two countries producing different goods, one country might have the lower cost in terms of resources used of producing all of them. But what's important is the comparative advantage. This refers to the lowest opportunity cost to produce a product. So we usually measure that in terms of what other goods and services do we have to give up to produce this good or this service. So the law of comparative advantage is that trade makes all countries better off compared to no trade. Each country specializes in the goods they produce most efficiently and then trades for other goods. So the countries are going to tend to specialize in the goods for which they have a comparative advantage, and this is where the gains from trade come from. So the outcome is increased worldwide output and wealth, with no country particularly being worse off. Although, as I said, some specific groups within these countries will be disadvantaged by the trade. But overall, there are gains to both economies. So let's take a look at an old-time example here that illustrates this idea of comparative advantage, and make sure you can work with it. Now, we've got a chart here that says we have two countries, England and Portugal, and they both produce two goods, cloth and wine. Good choices. So, in England, we're measuring this in labor units to produce a certain amount of cloth. And that's 100 in England and 90 in Portugal. So we would say Portugal has an absolute advantage in producing cloth. Since we're looking only at labor here, the resource costs to produce that cloth are lower. Now, if we look at wine, we see Portugal also has an absolute advantage in wine because it takes 110 labor units to produce a unit of wine, however large that is, in England and 80 in Portugal. So does this mean that there's no gains from trade? No, it doesn't, because we've got to focus on the comparative advantage. Now, to get the comparative advantage, let's just first look at England here. Okay. How much cloth do they have to give up in order to produce a unit of wine? Okay. What's their relative costs? Well, the opportunity cost is 100 versus 110 in terms of wine. So we're going to say Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine. Now, how much cloth does Portugal give up producing wine? Well, we've got 80 units of labor to produce the wine. We've got 90 units of labor to produce the cloth. So each unit of wine has a cost of 8/9 of a unit of cloth. And now we look in England. In England, how much cloth do we give up to produce wine? Well, we give up 11/10, right? 110 over 100. 11/10 of a unit of cloth, 1.1 units of cloth for a unit of wine. In Portugal, 8/9 of a unit of cloth to produce a unit of wine. So that's how we do the comparative advantage, is look at the opportunity cost. Now, if they ran the other way, we'll find out that we're just flipping these fractions upside down. So if one country has a comparative advantage in one good in a two-good world, the other one must have a comparative advantage in the other. We'd just flip these over. So we'd get the opportunity cost of wine, of wine in Portugal is going to be 9/8 units of cloth. And in England, it's going to be 10/11 unit of cloth. So there you have it. We've got our comparative advantage. So what should the outcome be? Well, if Portugal specializes in wine, the good in which they have a comparative advantage, and England specializes in cloth, then given the resources available, we're going to be able to produce more of both. And by trade, both countries can be made better off. So that's the idea here, and make sure you can compute those, calculate those opportunity costs, and keep it straight. Which country has a comparative advantage in which good. And remember that absolute advantage doesn't tell us anything about the gains from trade. So this slide just kind of reiterates some of what I just said. If Portugal specializes in wine, England specializes in cloth, both are better off, and trade also produces benefits from economies of scale, right? If they're scaling up their wine productivity in Portugal and the cloth productivity in England, then they can have economies of scale there. And also, cross-border competition does lead to more efficient production. Whenever there's competition from other suppliers, it forces us toward more efficient methods of production. Okay, so here's some models of trade that kind of build on that. This Ricardian model is like we just looked at, the one we just looked at. Labor is the only factor of production in the Ricardian model, named after the economist Ricardo, model. Comparative advantage depends on the relative labor productivity for different goods. Well, that's what we just saw. Okay? So, simple model from the olden days, that's the Ricardo model, or at least his model's consistent with that example. Now, you're supposed to be conversant with another model here, the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, there's two factors of production, both capital and labor. Remember, in our earlier example, we didn't look at capital allocations at all, just at the labor inputs. Now, the easy way to remember this is that the Heckscher-Ohlin model has two names in it. And it also has both factors of production, two factors of production, capital and labor. So two names in the model, capital and labor. One name, Ricardo, in the model, that's based only on labor, not capital. So that should help you keep those straight. Okay. So under this Heckscher-Ohlin model, it turns out there's a redistribution of wealth between the two factors of production because of international trade. So we open it up to trade. The Heckscher-Ohlin model tells us there's going to be a redistribution of wealth. How is the wealth redistributed? Well, whatever the more abundant resource that the country has, that price is going to increase because we're going to shift production once trade opens up to the goods where there's the most abundant resource. So if one country has an awful lot of capital, it'll shift toward capital-intensive goods. If the other has relatively more labor, then labor is going to be better off in that country. So, important point. Results in a wealth transfer within a country from the scarce resource, so that's a little counterintuitive, to the abundant resource. But remember, we're shifting production toward the good that has the abundant resource, in relatively more abundant resource in that country. So make sure you know that fact. So what are the types of trade restrictions you need to be familiar with? Well, a tariff is just a tax on imported goods. So if there's a tariff of $50 a ton on imported steel coming into the country, all exporters to the country, they've got to pay this extra $50 tax. Now, a quota has similar effects, but it's set up differently. A quota says you can only export this much to the domestic country. So it puts a limit on the quantity of goods imported. And we'll look at the differences on that in terms of where the revenues go to in just a minute. An export subsidy is a payment by the government to domestic exporters. So if the government has a policy of wanting to expand exports, they can put these subsidies in place, government payments that says, well, when you export goods, we're going to pay you some money. Minimum domestic content specifies required proportion of product content to be sourced domestically. So this is a restriction on trade. It says, well, you can bring this into the country, but these components or enough of these components have to be domestically manufactured, or it could be the assembly of parts when they get there, but it's just another way of restricting trade. A voluntary export restraint, or a VER, is an exporting country that agrees to limit the quantity of goods they will export. So I think they really do it to avoid quotas or tariffs. So if a country is acting like it's going to be protectionist of a particular industry, particular class of goods, and there's an exporter country that exports those goods and it's important to them, they may put in a voluntary restriction to calm things down in the domestic country and maybe not have new rules, regulations, laws passed that turn into things like tariffs and quotas. So the effect is going to be about the same. The point is that it's voluntary rather than imposed by the domestic country. So here's our fancy graph on tariffs and quotas. Okay? And we can use some of our microanalysis to take a look at that. So in this diagram that we've got right now, we see there's the world price. No protectionism. There's the world price. Okay? And there's domestic supply. So this line here says imports with free trade. So at that price, domestic producers will supply that much. But demand at that price, quantity demanded, is out here, QD1. So this much is supplied by domestic suppliers, and the rest of this is imported. So let's clear that off and move forward here. So now we're going to put some trade restrictions on. And those trade restrictions are going to be such that we've increased the price domestically, not the world price, but the domestic price, okay, by that amount, shifted it up to that protection price there. Well, now we can see the imports are going to be less. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do this. If we put on a tariff equal to that, that would just raise the domestic price to here. We would have more supplied by domestic suppliers and less demand at that higher price. So I think if I click this forward, we'll see that that's the imports with protection right there. Now, I've talked about that as if it were a tariff of that height, that cost imposed, but it could just be a tariff, a quota. If we put a quota and said the maximum import is this piece right here, we'd end up with that same result. The difference between the quota and the tariff is this area right here. If there's a tariff, the domestic government is collecting tariff revenue equal to this rectangle here because they've collected this much on each unit. So with a tariff, there's money that goes to the domestic government. And so this is a way of taxation. Especially before income taxes and things like that, countries found it much more effective to tax things coming into the country because they could control that and keep a grip on it. So it's been very popular for that reason, if for no other. So if we move this slide forward a little bit, we'll see these various areas. That's what I just described as either the tariff revenue, and we sometimes call that quota rents. Now, we don't know how these quotas are awarded, but we do know that the exporters to the domestic country that get the rights under the quota to export that amount of goods could have gains equal to that, right? Because their cost of production, their opportunity cost of selling somewhere else is that world price. So if because of the quota they can get a higher price in this domestic country, that's the rents to the quota. Now, these rents could be paid in bribes to whoever's allocating these quotas. We don't know that they're collecting all those rents, but think of those as two extremes. One, with a tariff, the domestic government gets it all. With a quota, It's not sure who gets it, but we know it's not all paid to the domestic government. And if these quotas were awarded by drawing, by a lottery, then those rents would accrue to whoever won those export quota rights. Now, overall, we can see the effect on the domestic economy as well. And we've got all this, here's domestic demand. We've got all this consumer surplus, right? So let's start out at the world price. This is all consumer surplus. Well, look what consumer surplus is afterwards. Okay? We've got the new price, and we've got that. So we can see what the lost consumer surplus is all the way down here. Well, some of that consumer surplus is lost because less goods are traded, right? Our equilibrium quantity is reduced. But part of that, and I'll clean up this mess now, part of that is because we have a gain in producer surplus here to domestic suppliers. So when I say that domestic suppliers, owners of assets and labor that are specific to this industry, or at least currently involved in this industry, okay, this protectionist quota or tariff increases their welfare. There's that gain in producer surplus. So we saw the decrease in consumer surplus. Part of that has now gone to surplus profits for domestic suppliers, so they are made better off. But it goes back to this argument that the losses of all that consumer surplus are larger than the gains in producer surplus. So even though producers of this good are better off, the economy as a whole is not better off. And I think that's illustrated here with one more click. Nope, that was the end of it. Okay, so decrease in consumer surplus domestically, increase in producer surplus that's smaller than that, maybe tariff revenue to the government, or maybe quota rents to those exporters who receive the quota. And in any event, the overall quantity is reduced. The domestic price is increased. So let's look at this in terms of reasons for trade restrictions. Well, just what we've lined up so far. Protecting domestic jobs and protecting domestic producers. It's as simple as that. Now, there are some other reasons given. Countering foreign trade restrictions and export subsidies. Well, this is back and forth, right? If one country is subsidizing its production of agricultural goods and they're exporting to another country, agricultural workers in that second country are going to be made worse off. The price comes in lower because of this government subsidy to the exporters or the growers in that country. Well, this is often one of the contentious things because within the laws of many countries and the taxes and everything else, there's certain supports given to certain industries, probably through some sort of political lobbying, but be that as it may, they exist and they're part of the political reality. They also have anti-dumping, and that is a country can't sell it at lower than cost to get rid of it and preserve the size of their domestic industry. Okay. And, of course, governments like revenues from tariffs. So that's also another reason for protectionism. Now, this last point, it says a large country could actually decrease the world price by imposing a quota or tariff. Well, this kind of goes against our overall idea of, well, overall we're going to be worse off. Now, the important word here is could. You just need to know that it's possible that that could happen. There is a set of conditions. If a country is a really large importer of a good, they can actually decrease the world price by imposing a quota or tariff, reducing their consumption of imports of that good by so much that it actually impacts the world price. So remember, this is a possibility. You might put something right below that that says, this is possible. Okay, moving on to our next LOS. Let's look at all the effects of these trade restrictions. Okay, tariff, domestic consumer loses. Well, we might as well go down this way, because we're going to claim, the economists conclude, that tariffs, quota, voluntary export restraints, or an export subsidy, the domestic consumer loses in all those cases. And domestic producers gain in all those cases. So that part is not hard to remember. So let's see what's going on the other side here with the domestic government and the foreign exporter. Well, the foreign exporter loses in the case of a tariff. It's just a tax on them exporting their goods. And the domestic government gains. Remember, they gain by the amount of the tariff revenues. With a quota system, we think the foreign exporter gains, and the domestic government might gain with a quota system. But it depends on where the quota rents go. Okay? If they all go to the foreign exporter, then fine. Foreign exporter gains. Okay? If the domestic government is getting something for issuing these quotas, then they could gain. So somewhere in between the two, there must be some gains there somewhere. Now, voluntary export restraints, well, the domestic government doesn't gain anything from that. Okay? The foreign exporter can gain from that, but domestic consumers lose and domestic producer gains. So we're talking about trade with voluntary export restraints. There's still going to be some gains to foreign exporters. And lastly, an export subsidy in the domestic country. Domestic consumer loses. Okay. We're actually saying we're going to subsidize exports, so we have more exports. That's going to raise the whole price. Domestic consumers lose. Domestic producers gain because we're subsidizing their sales to a foreign country. Domestic government loses because they pay the export subsidy, and the foreign exporter doesn't come into play in this scenario. So if you can keep this table straight, okay, this one's the only one that had some real what-if kind of issues tied to it, and that's just how these quota rents are shared between the government and the exporter. Now, another type of restrictions besides trade restrictions that we run into in international finance is capital restrictions, restrictions on the flow of financial capital. And this can take a few forms, as we've got listed in those bullet points here. Either just a prohibition on flows of capital in or out of the country. There could be some sort of taxation to inhibit but not prohibit flows of foreign capital in and out of the country, and maybe restrictions on repatriation, that capital can flow into the country but not back out. So all of these restrictions decrease economic welfare, and that's our economic story all along, is restrictions decrease overall welfare, except in some very special circumstances. Now, this could have a short-term benefit, though. When you have developing countries, and sometimes capital flows in, right? We saw this in some of the Asian countries over the last 15 years or so. Capital flows into the country, but then when things aren't going so well there, the growth isn't so well, there's any kind of unrest, turmoil, uncertainty, things like that, then the foreign capital leaves very quickly as well. And that leads to volatility. Volatility in the asset values, volatility in equity values across the board. Because you've got big companies with lots of capital either rushing into a country or rushing out of a country, and this can be disruptive, as you might imagine. So in the short term, there may be some benefits of putting some capital restrictions on capital flows into and out of the country. But in the long term, their isolation from global capital markets and not getting the benefits of foreign investment are going to be a long-term cost. So in the short run, it might make some sense. In the long run, it's certainly not good for the country's overall welfare to isolate themselves in terms of capital flows, foreign investment, and opportunities to invest in other countries as well. Oop, got a little too far ahead there. Now we got to talk about trading blocks, common markets, and economic unions. Okay. We know that economic welfare is improved by reducing trade restrictions. We're telling this story very consistently. Gains from reducing trade restrictions between member countries are offset by losses if the bloc increases restrictions on non-member countries. So we're going to talk about a common market where we say, okay, like North American free trade, right? Said, okay, we can have trade between